Hello everyone, and welcome to my first tutorial video for AGD. Today I'm going to show you how you can create a rope using sprites. So I'm going to assume that you already know how to create a kind of basic setup. That's what I've done here. You can see I've got a little man and he's got a big chasm there that he has to get across. Here you can see my little sprite. You can use your own. I'm sure you know already how to do that. So that's him. I've created some blocks there, as you can see, and it's a pretty basic setup. There it is. Bricks, chasm, and a space that's about 8 blocks across, which should be too far for the fella to jump across. So we're going to have to build him a little rope. Let's do a little test. Here he is. Let's have him do a little jump, and no chance at all he's going to make that jump. Absolutely impossible. So let's build him a rope. Okay, so the first thing we're going to have to do is go into the sprite creator, and there we're going to create a set of frames which will allow us to make a sprite. We need to have 8 frames of animation for this, for the main part of the rope, and you can see here I'm busy just steadily making a rope, and I think what I'll do is make another clip and fast forward through this process, because this is going to take a little while, and you can basically tune in again in a moment. I'll be back to show you the completed set. Alright, see you in a minute. Okay, and we are back here with the sprite editor, and I've got 2 sprites here. The first one, of course, is the main rope. We'll take a look at that now. This is basically just a line. The most important thing to remember is that we have to make sure that the frames all line up properly. So the top pixel here and the bottom pixel here there should be a point. That's the join point, basically. You can change the look of the rope, of course, if you want. Make it look more like a real rope, or maybe like a vine, or whatever you want for your game. But make sure that you remember that those top and bottom pixels help with the alignment of the rope itself, and it will look a little bit strange if you don't do that. But of course you can play about with it. Now I've gone through the frames here. You can pause the video, step back, copy these if you want to. That's basically the idea there. Now moving on, we can look at the second set of frames which we're going to use for our rope, which are here. Now this is used for the very bottom part of the rope. It's not necessary. It does use up a bit more memory, and obviously that means that that could be a priority for you. But if you want the rope to look that little bit nicer, then you can add these frames at the bottom. This will also be sprite type 1, and again, pause the video if you want to copy these. You could even put a little handle at the bottom here or something like that if you felt like it. It just gives the rope just a little more detail, and helps with the overall feel, I think. So that's that. You've got the 2 frames. It's all set up. Let's take a look at how it looks on the screen itself. Okay, so I've set the frames up here, and the most important thing to remember here is when you set this up, that you put the sprites in the order that you create them. The first sprite should be at the top, and it should go from the top down. Of course, if you want to make it bigger, you could move this rope down here, but I don't think we need to do that. We'll just use the 3 frames here. So the first sprite I created, there's the player, there's the first one, there's the second one, there's the third one. It has to be in that order, because we're going to assign an ID to each of these frames, and each of them is going to have different animations so that the whole thing lines up and looks like a rope. Otherwise it'll just be a big mess. Let's just test. Here we can see, yep, our little chap can certainly reach that rope there at its furthest left, so that's absolutely fine. could make it a little more difficult for him if we wanted to. So yeah, that's that. We're pretty much ready now to start looking at the animation. So the first thing we need to do is to set up the sprite IDs. So the first thing we do is go into the restart screen and choose let r equal 0. This is going to be our counter for our sprites to give them an ID. So it starts with 0 when the screen starts. Now we go to initialize sprite and we choose type 1, which of course is our rope. We choose let direction 2, which is of course the direction, moving +2 at first. Param A, which is our ID, which is R. We add 1 to R so that it increases every time. And finally we have param B, which is 0. That's an internal timer which is going to determine the speed of the rope. Okay, so now we've got the ID set up, we're ready to go into sprite type 1. The first thing we're going to do for our rope is set up the timer, which I already mentioned. This is an internal timer, which means it won't affect anything else. If param B is greater than 0, subtract 1 from param B, which basically means that param B will count down, and we can set the level of param B to be higher or lower, and the frames will be quicker or slower depending on what we do. Obviously the higher the number, the slower the rope. So here now we check if param B is if it has reached 0, and if it has, we'll start the code. And here is the main part of the code. Repeat param A. You remember param A is our sprite ID, so it's 0 for the first one, 1 for the second, 2 for the third. And what we're doing here is we're adding direction, which is +2, to the horizontal coordinate. And what this basically means is that for the first sprite there won't be any, because this is 0, repeat 0. For the second one it'll do it once. For the third one it'll do it twice. If we had more, there would be a 3 and a 4. In other words, the first top of the rope doesn't move, the second one moves by 2 spaces, the third by 4. So each part of the rope is moving at a different speed. Okay, so now we look at our animation. If the direction is 2, which is moving to the right, we should animate. Otherwise, we should animate back. So as the sprite is moving to the right, it will move forward, and the animation will go back when it's moving back. So when it's reached its furthest point to the right, which is frame 7, we need to tell it to change direction. So if it reaches frame 7, end of the line, and direction is 2, it's still moving to the right, then change the direction to 254. Now 254 is basically the same as -2. The reason we use that is that the code at the top, then we don't need to check for direction again, we can just add it, and adding 254 is the same as subtracting 2, so it saves on code and it's quite efficient. Now we repeat the process for when it swings all the way back to the left. If the frame is 0, not 1, and the direction is 254, which is of course swinging to the left, then change direction back to +2. So that's now our code done for swinging the rope backwards and of course forwards. Now remember, all of this is inside the condition of the timer param B. So the last thing that we need to do, just to make sure we remember, is to add one more end if, as you can see at the top there, if param B. So let's compile that, go back and check just to make sure it's okay. That's always good practice. Make sure that you've got the right number of ifs and end ifs and everything matches. It all does. Everything's inside that param B. So obviously param B is 0 right now. We can see there the rope is swinging very, very quickly, but the movement is good. We now just need to sort out the timings. So let's look at that next. Okay, so let's start looking at this timer. The first thing I want to do is show you that if we set param B to be a different number, then the rope will of course move at a different speed. So we'll set it here at a value of 5, which means every 5 cycles the rope will move another step. Let's take a quick look at that, and of course now we can see the rope is moving a lot more slowly than it was before. But the thing about that is that there's no real impression of gravity acting on it, and it actually looks almost like it's moving around in a kind of a circle. So what we really want is for the rope to move slowly when it's at the far right and the far left as it's changing direction, and more quickly in the center, and that will give us the impression at least of a certain amount of gravity acting on the rope itself. This is fairly easy to do. We'll change the parameter of param B, according to the frame. So what we'll do first of all is we'll set a default param B of 2, and that will mean the rope is actually moving really quite quickly, and that will be the speed that it's moving at the very center, which is going to be frames 3 and frames 4. Okay, now here, frame 7, we know that that is the point at which it's at its furthest to the right, and that's when it's going to be moving more slowly, so we'll set param B to be 10 when it's frame 7. Similarly, when we look at frame 0, which we know is that its furthest point to the left, we can also know that it's going to be moving more slowly, so we will let param B be equal to 10 here as well. Now ultimately what we're going to do is go through each of the frames and set a different param B, so that basically the rope is going to speed up and slow down as it reaches the middle and as it reaches the outer left and the right sides. So let's take a quick look now just to see what effect we've already had. And as we can see, the rope is now stopping, at least at the right and the left, because it's switching from 2 to 10, and that's a pretty dramatic shift, and it doesn't really look like a rope swinging along, but it's a good start. So now let's implement the full timer effect. What we're going to do now is add param B values for the rest of the frames. So the first one to think about is frame 1, because we've already done frame 0, and so frame 1 is going to be param B 6, so it's going from 10 down to 6, so it's speeding up. After that we're going to look at frame 2, and frame 2 is going to get a little bit quicker again, so this time param B is going to be 4, and following that we are going to look at frame 5, because we've already got param B 2 as our default, so we don't need to do anything for frames 3 and 4. So for frame 5 we're going to set param B the same as frame 2, which is a 4. Frame 6 is going to be param B 6, and that means we've now got a param B setting for all the frames. As you can see there, 0 is 10, frame 1 is 6, then 4, and then we have 2 default setting param B 2, so we don't need to change those, just saves on if statements basically, and then it swings, as it swings along all the way across to 7 it slows again, and so for that reason there we can see that each frame has its own set of individual timings, and that should, with only a few extra lines of code, give us a much nicer rope effect, which is going to look more like it's actually swinging. And there you can see the rope is really properly swinging now, looking like something which has at least a little bit of gravity to it. So that's pretty much it for the rope itself. The next thing we need to think about is how we can get our little man to jump to it. Let's check if we can first of all reach it, and he can definitely reach it, that's not a problem, but we've got no collision detection, so let's look at that next. So as you can see, I've gone into now the player sprite, and I have here a short command here, if collision 1, in other words if he hits the rope, then stop him from falling, and if not, then he should fall. So if we add that command, we'll see what happens now with the rope. We'll run over, jump on the rope, and missed. Let's try one more time. Yeah, there you go. So you can see this doesn't look very realistic, of course, but it does mean that when our chap is on the rope, at least he's not going to fall, and if we're clever we can actually walk across. But that isn't really how ropes work, so we need to do a little bit more than that. Okay, so what we're going to do now is try and make the man move along with the rope. So the easiest thing we can do here is, rather than have the man detect the rope, we'll have the rope detect the man. So we'll go into sprite 1, if collision 0, in other words, if the man hits the rope, we should record the direction and the param A value of the part of the rope that's been hit, and we will then transfer that over to the player. In other words, the movement, direction, and the amount of movement, which are determined by direction and param A, as we previously saw, we'll actually put those now into the player sprite, and we'll use the same formula we used before. So repeat P, which is of course from param A, add D to Y, which is direction, and then we'll go back to the original so that the rest of the code can run. But essentially what we've done there is we've transferred the code for the rope movement directly over to the player. In other words, when the player hits the rope, the player will basically inherit the movement of the rope itself. So let's look at the difference now. If we stop, we can see, and there the player, we're getting a little bit closer to something that we want now, which is basically that the player is now just swinging. I'm not using the keys at all here. He's just basically being controlled by the rope itself, and I can jump off like that. And there you can see I jump back and forward like that. Now it's not ideal, and this method still needs a bit of polish, but it's certainly starting to get there. So let's see if we can at least improve it a little bit more by adding some different animation. Okay, just to give a bit more detail then, what we're going to do is add a little frame of animation for the man swinging. There you can see moving to the right and moving to the left, frame 0, frame 1 in sprite number 4. And so what we'll do is we'll write in the code as the man is moving, as the rope is moving rather, the bit where we check the direction of the player, we'll also make sure that the player is let me just fix this little pixel here, just a second. Okay, we'll make sure the player is moving in the right direction. So you can see here I've got other, let image 4, that is the man swinging, let frame equals 0, moving to the right, or if D is 254, in other words moving to the left, let frame equal 1. Let's run that code, and there we go. You can see as he jumps on, he's now swinging with his little animation. It's not perfectly lined up with the rope, and that's something that I would like to look at a little bit more as I play about with this, and perhaps some of you guys might like to look at that as well. Perhaps you've got some ideas, some suggestions. You can maybe leave them in the comments below, or on the Facebook group if you like. But essentially we've pretty much got everything we need there for the game to be fun. It's not absolutely perfect, but it's certainly fun, and that's probably the most important thing. Now to finish up, just going to show you very quickly that it's actually pretty straightforward, because of the way that it's coded, to change the length of the rope. So I'm going to make this chasm a little bit wider and give the guy a little bit more distance to cover. Of course, another factor that you could add into this is you could put a few more enemies flying around and so on. That would make it certainly a little bit more of a challenge. There's lots of different ways that you can do that. So yeah, I'm going to add another 2 frames, I should say another 2 sprites, which will be 5 in total. Obviously that does limit you to the number of enemies you can have, but usually in a game when there's a rope, there's usually not that many enemies, so it shouldn't be that much of a problem. So I'm adding here, as you can see, I've added another sprite, and I'm going to do, I think, just one more for the bottom. Let's make sure they're in order, 1, 2, 3, 4. As I said, don't forget to do that. It won't work if you don't. So we'll add that one onto there. We've now got 5 sprites all working. set that one to be the animation frame of the rope swinging. They all move at different speeds, and as you can see, there we go, the rope is swinging quite happily with the speed changes and everything else. So he can jump across, and it was easy enough to just change the size. And you can put the rope where you want as well. The only thing you can't really do is do more than one rope on one screen. It's possible, but I haven't coded it yet. So that's pretty much it. Thanks a lot, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. I'd like to see if there are any games using these ropes. It'd be good to see. Don't forget to use a like, leave a comment if you have a question, and I would look forward to seeing you soon.